and welcome to today's blog entitled The Problem with Exile. So, picking up the story of the Israelite people, they are exiled in Babylon and left with a strong sense that they have been abandoned by God, that Yahweh is no longer with them. Even after their return to Israel and the building of the Second Temple, there was a sense that something was missing, both in the physical sense, with things such as the Ark of the Covenant, but also on a deeper spiritual level. When was God going to return to them? Was he going to come back? This feeling of ennui or apathy was picked up by the prophet Malachi, particularly in chapter 3. He asked people if they would be ready for God's return, as they were merely going through the motions of God's law and making unworthy temple sacrifices, almost doing the bare minimum to keep the laws, but their hearts weren't really in it. However, he does give a message of hope, that there's time to change this, as God would send his messenger before his arrival to prepare the way for him. Of course, the most well-known prophet passages about God's return we looked at in detail in our last blog, Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. Comfort, comfort my people. Yahweh will return. The good news of chapter 52 verses 7 to 13, stating that the Israelite people would once again see the return of God to Zion. But then, looking at chapter 53, the description of the presence of God is something quite different to what was expected, the suffering servant. And it's at this point that the New Testament picks up the story. And so we come to the Gospel of Mark, and we're looking particularly today at chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. Now, each of the Gospels begins differently. Matthew starts with the genealogy, then he and Luke look at the birth of Jesus. John looks at how Jesus is God, and Jesus and God were one at the very beginning of time, the famous reading we have every Christmas. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he moves on to John the Baptist. Mark is different again. Mark begins by quoting Malachi and Isaiah. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way. Actually taken from Malachi chapter 3 verse 1. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. Taken from Isaiah chapter 40 verse 3. Mark then goes on to describe John the Baptist. Full of imagery, John the Baptist is depicted as the new Elijah, the voice in the wilderness, preparing the way for God's return. We then have the baptism of Jesus. And verse 10 starts, just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice from heaven came, you are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased. The writer is making an obvious point that this is what God looks like when he comes back. The God of Israel that had been promised and prophesied, the Messiah in human form. So this is a very different Messiah than the ones that the Jews were expecting, and yet Mark's opening chapter is littered with references to point to Jesus as just that. This last reference, from verse 11, is taken from the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. At this point in the book of Samuel, God is telling David that his descendant will become king as he had been. The idea that Jesus will build a house is saying that Jesus himself will become the new temple, the new meeting place between human and God, and also picks up the concept of the kingdom of God, a far more complex idea than just dying and going to heaven. In Jesus, God has returned to be both King and Messiah. He is here to say that heaven and earth are to become one, as in the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven. The idea of the New Jerusalem, or the new creation, is not to be a paradise in another place. It is to be in this place, as heaven comes to earth. This might sound complicated, but it gives us hope, a hope that is sorely needed in a broken world. Mark's Gospel gives us a narrative of God's surprising return fulfilled in Jesus, giving his followers the hope of heaven and earth together becoming a reality. Thank you. Goodbye for now.